Well, thank you, Dean Brennan, for those very nice remarks. Thank all of you for coming, speakers and audience. I think we're going to have a productive and interesting day today, and I hope today isn't the end of it. I hope that we can stay in communication with each other over these issues, right? Link our networks together. So I got to thank people, not just the dean, but I also have to thank Nwa Case and Danny Murphy. You might not have met them yet, but you will meet them. They put the whole thing together. People here who know me know that if this comes together, it can't possibly have had anything to do with me because you know my organizational skills. Well, I don't have organizational skills, so they are a mystery to you. But when this comes together, it comes together like anything. It comes together because there's a network. There are a bunch of people who get together to do things. I'm the invite guy. Come to my conference. Come to my conference. It'll be fantastic. So UK has been a great place to visit. This is a fantastic law school. I have been, overwhelmed with kindnesses since arriving in September. Well, childhood then. Childhood bears a unique relationship to time. It's in childhood that we first learn how to express ourselves. It's in childhood that we first learn to look for meaning in the universe. It's in childhood that we first learn that our needs will be met, if they are met. It is in childhood that we first learn how to be kind and brave. If we don't learn these freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, as children, then we may never learn them. That was a really clever way to bring up FDR's 4 freedoms, right? If democracy, as FDR famously stated in January of 1941, is built on these 4 essential freedoms, then childhood, and this symposium is that argument, then childhood is the head cornerstone. But what about the stone that the builders refused? Right, the country tumbled at the very beginning on race. Right, this half-slave, half-free, non-democracy stumbles on the matter of race. Our conference will focus on the 4 freedoms and race. FDR may have saved the country, but he did not save us. Blacks were left out of the New Deal. Right? Agricultural workers and domestic workers, and that's the work most of us were doing at that time, were left out, and we were left out in other ways as well. But those 4 freedoms still stand for what democracy is supposed to stand for what the completion of democracy is supposed to be. And if democracy is ever going to be anything, it starts, as I argued earlier, in childhood. So our conference will focus on the 4 freedoms and race. Black childhood, as we see on the news every day now, and we're just one state away from that preemptive state of emergency in Ferguson. Black childhood is in danger. What's freedom of speech without the right to an education? What's freedom of worship amidst nihilistic erasures of black childhood? What's freedom from want when most of black childhood is lived below the poverty line? What's freedom from fear when black childhood is itself feared? Democracy requires these questions to be answered, and childhood's relationship to time means that there is such a thing as too late. And, old people out there, people will recognize that I was just channeling Martin Luther King, right? There is such a thing as too late. As academics and activists from all over the country, I think we're here from 12 different states, we're here to answer, or at least to address, these urgent questions of race, childhood, and democracy. I've divided those questions into 4 panels. We'll look at black childhood and philosophy. What is it? Black childhood and danger, black childhood and fear, and black childhood and education. Now, the overall title of this was Freedom from Fear. The idea of freedom from fear, when FDR put that new kind of freedom out there, was that the world's democracies had a duty to disarm themselves so that no country would have the ability to fight against another country. Right? To remove aggression from our lives was to remove fear from our lives and to finally realize everyone's right to freedom from fear. We haven't done that. We have militarized And if we look at the patterns of militarization around the country, we see a war on black childhood itself. Right? Look at Ferguson, but then look away and look everywhere else. Right? It's a metaphor for what we've done in city after city after city. Why are police armed? I got laughed at in Houston, by the way, at the school that I'm going to be teaching at now in a visiting chair, so maybe history has absolved me. I got laughed at when I suggested, right, Spirit, my future colleague in the back, when I suggested that police be disarmed, that we learn how to do a kind of grown-up policing, finding techniques and people who know how to de-escalate extreme situations the way they do in other countries around the globe. Now, that might have been treated as funny when I put it out a little bit before its time, but now when we see police departments and even school systems that own tanks, it's not so funny. But what I want to do today, I'll wrap this up at the end at 3 o'clock, but I want to just right now just want to give you a sense of what's coming up, and then turn everything over to our panelists. We're going to keep everything on time, but we're going to keep track of each other so the conversations don't have to end with each panel. They don't have to end with this conference. They can continue. We'll all meet again. So I'll turn it over to the moderator for our first panel.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Shella Swack-Cryer. I am a professor at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. So our first panel is Black Childhood and Education. And the format that we've decided on this morning is that each of our speakers will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and we'll save questions for the panel at the end. And each of our speakers has an extremely illustrious biography, so I strongly encourage you to read the bios at the end. For the sake of time, I will just be introducing their names and school. So our first presenter is Professor Michelle Alexander from the University of Mississippi School of Law. Next, we have Professor Reginald Robinson from Howard Law School.
I thought I was first.
Well, but you second now. After Professor Robinson, we have Professor Janet Steverson, yes, who's also out in Oregon with me at Lewis and Clark University School of Law. And finally, Professor Andre Smith from Widener Law School. Without further ado, we will begin our panel.
Good morning. So I think I have to thank Anthony and the University of Kentucky for having this. I think it's a crucial and important focus, and particularly for us in law schools, thinking about ways of merging activism with scholarship. My focus, as my talks indicate, has to do will be on more of the legacy and indoctrination that children get. So the central takeaway I want you to consider is that our indoctrination, though subtle sometimes, and though accepted pretty widely, is a root of violence for children. And that children, even in K-12, experience violence to their body and to their spirit just by the mere rigidity that we impose on classifications of gender. So the talk is entitled Ground Zero of the Battle, Sexual Profiling in the K-12 Setting. I have, I start with the fairy tale Rapunzel. And when he approached, Rapunzel knew and fell on his neck and wept. He led her to his kingdom where he was joyfully received, and they lived for a long time. Afterwards, happily ever. Our fairy tales, the boy rescues the girl, and then we're supposed to go home and consider that the masculine quality is to be overachieving and slay everything in one's obstacles, and the feminine quality is involves some type of passivity and waiting with bated breath. This comes to a head in the K-12 setting. Obviously, you all are concerned about this issue. You know the data showing that the school to pipeline program is alive and well. Any of our kids that don't fall into the classification of how to perform maleness and how to perform femaleness, particularly our children of color, because performing maleness and performing femaleness gets more complicated for us as folks of color, because if we are too aggressive, even though this is acceptable for some other groups, for black males that is considered dangerous, and they are automatically channeled into the penalization structure, and they end up very quickly as teenagers in the various form of prisonhood, detention, to worse. Same thing for females. Studies for young girls. Studies conducted by educators have shown that girls, even though there's this myth that young girls get black girls do better than black boys, it is a very tight rope that the young black girls are walking in the K-12 setting, in that when they are too assertive, they are considered as loud and they get penalized. And so for a young black girl to get educational benefits, she has to walk that line. And educators sitting in classrooms have noted this and this again, that there's a similar track for our babies, for black girls, and that those who do well obviously are the ones who are able to maneuver that, or else the ones that are outspoken, the one that manifests a femaleness that somehow is too pronounced based on what is regulated on young girls' bodies, get in trouble. They get chastised more. They don't get the platform, and then they might seen as equally dangerous and get to that path. Not to the same extent in concrete numbers of incarceration as our black boys, but the result in terms of access to educational opportunity is the same. So I want us to consider that I've written my book is entitled Sexploitation, the Illusion of Gender. So because we talk about freedom from fear and we talking about danger, the idea of talking about gender and classification might seem like, I'm coming from a more theoretical angle, but I am putting to you that what I'm talking about is the forefront of it, that the violence and the attacks on our bodies are also rooted in the classifications of maleness and femaleness. And the fact that we are so, even our own communities, obviously we are attacked by external communities, but even in our own communities, we haven't done the work yet of releasing ourselves from the illusion of what it is to be men and what it is to be a woman. And we all know that this construction of gender doesn't exist. It's something that we created for ourselves in order to limit and create pathways of power. So if that's the case, why are we so attached to it? So very quickly, in my last, is 5 minutes, monitor? In my last 5 minutes, I just want to make a few points to highlight, I think, how we could approach this differently. So in K-12, this is where children learn very early the male-female binary and its roles. And they not only learn that, but they learn that it's the role, performing the role of that female-male binary is more important than anything else. That when you don't conform, then there's a high price to pay. So, few examples of that have been chronicled and been looking, because the cases are not as live. But the incidents in K-12, for example, of young, otherly genders children, whether transgender or intersex, trying to use a different bathroom, and the whole school just galvanizing to make this not happen. And immediately the young baby is ostracized, and everyone else, every other children in the school get the message that at your own death, you will choose something else than be that part of that dichotomy that I've told you about. There are other ways to deal with this, right? I mean, we understand that gender identity is something that everybody's learning, but that extreme fear that choice generates, that then is translated to the young children, so that they know very early that no matter what they might be feeling, the choice will have too high of a cost. And that instead they should consider otherwise, stifle themselves. And those who are brave enough very early to do this in K-12 suffer great ramification. Another example, and you've heard this many times, children, young children, young student in K-12 trying to get into a mixed soccer team or trying to make the soccer team mixed. Again, violent reaction, violent opposition. Another very simple one, a young child, and you know, I'm old now, so I call them babies and child. A young student coming to a prom or something like it, a junior prom, in a tuxedo. That sounds very simple, right? That triggered some violent reaction from that particular school system. But consider a model, for example, some school in Sweden deliberately develop a model of early education designed to undo the damages of gender bias. The plan targets language, removes arbitrary sex descriptions as determinative factors in language, and they focus on gender-neutral pronouns. In doing so, the model attempts to remove explicit and deliberate effects of constant emphasis on sex and genitalia in the treatment of adults as well as children. Furthermore, the model selects gender-neutral stories and toys, avoiding the legacy of gender roles containing fairy tales, dolls, and other boys. One of the most effective portion of the plan consists in adults deciding to deliberately console children, console them in gender-neutral ways when they get hurt or experience conflict. The educators in the school system do this by videotaping themselves. The teachers in the school, they videotape their behavior and how they treat each group. And then they notice how we tacitly do this, how even in the use of he, she, we perpetrate these notions, how we console a boy versus consoling a girl. And then they rectify their behavior. So based on the feedback from this experiment, they began to encourage students of every gender to heal, to cry, to express pain in non-gendered ways. This happened in Sweden as a result of a full commitment from the government in Sweden, the mission statement, to eradicate gender bias. We say we have such commitment in our country, but it's all in legal and purportedly gender-neutral terms. But they've had that too. It wasn't working, just like it wasn't working for us. It's not working for us. So they decided they needed something more. So they started encouraging creation of these gender-neutral rehauling of education, and not gender-neutral just by saying the word. Checking ourselves when we want to impose meaning by our use of pronouns, when we impose meaning in messages, in the way we talk to a boy rather than a girl, all of that. I'm going to leave you with this, because I'm well, we all legal scholars, and because that's what we do, I'm going to leave you with this Title IX case called Lashonda versus Davis. Friend of Lashonda versus Davis, and this is a sexual harassment, student-on-student sexual harassment case where a student, Lashonda, brought this claim because there was a student in her class that constantly, she could not be in class. He would hit her, but it was all sexual, he was a baby too, but these were messages he had inherited. So that he would pull her, get her in the closet, just really harass her body. So, the issue obviously was whether or not the school should be responsible. The school had notice. They never did anything that would remove her from the harm. So in such a way that she could not follow the class. So eventually the majority of the court said, yes, the school was on notice. They didn't take the deliberate steps. Therefore the notice, extends to them and they're liable. Well, Justice Kennedy writes this opinion that is a mastery of encapsulating our biases. He says, what are we doing here, majority? In his dissenting opinion, he says, we are getting in the middle of transaction between children in K-12 setting. Boys will be boys. They negotiate these things. And there is no greater illustration of the harm we're doing when we have facts evidencing perpetration of violence, not because this young boy was evil, because that's what he learned. And we still have people who are very educated who think that, hey, it's not that bad. She'll figure it out. She'll negotiate it with him. So I use that case all the time with my students to just show the pervasiveness of these teachings and indoctrination, that we take it to our grave. And I, for one, want to reach 85 and 95 and see a change about this.
Morning. I was really taken by that last case because it seems to be the very thing that I'm thinking about. But my paper will look at the school-to-prison pipeline issue. That's the context for my talk. The foreground of the talk is thematic, a perception, testing, and ultimately I will try to make my best effort to connect where the disruptive, disrespectful, and aggressive behavior originates, so that I can begin to talk very seriously about how to end those things that endanger black children. So after 1994, after the Drug-Free School Act was passed, the federal government began to put pressure on states to adopt its zero-tolerance policy, and with sufficient pressure, more than likely financial, states began to fall into line and began to adopt a zero-tolerance policy, and that pretty much dealt not just with the drug issue and weapons or guns, but teachers had other concerns. School districts had other concerns. School administrators had other concerns. Those concerns were, how do we deal with the behavior that's going on in our classroom, in the halls, and elsewhere in the school that was disrupting materially and substantially the kind of educational goals of public schools? Well, when they began to sort of figure out how to manage sort of institutional behavior, that is, how to get students to be more compliant, I call it a compliant culture, they began to adapt the zero tolerance policy to their own sort of particular concerns. So it began to look at behavior, whether it was aggressive, whether it was disruptive. And let me give you a sense of what I mean by aggressive. Shoving was considered a reason to either suspend or expel. If a 5-year-old, it's a Florida case, if a 5-year-old, in this instance she was 5, had a temper tantrum, and if they believed that her conduct was in fact endangering others, they would, as in this case, call the police. She was handcuffed and bound and placed in a patrol car for 3 hours, more than likely while they got her parents to come to the school to sort of work this out. And so that case made the papers nationally and internationally, and we didn't look like we were fairly enlightened people as a result. So I'm trying to give you some sense of it's not just the purest form of aggression that we're talking about. It's behavior that, from the point of view of the teachers, and that raises other issues in my research, why are they so rule specific? Why are they so rule compliant? To try and get students to be much more mindful of what I call entrenched management, where those people at the top run it and those people at the bottom don't. One of the results from this approach is that there's an increasing number of students, particularly minorities, more specifically blacks and Latinos, who find themselves either expelled or suspended. And the other problem is not just the expulsion, is that how do you get readmitted? I just came across issues that said it's not just that they get expelled and there's some due process, the lowest threshold of which is notice, but the problem becomes that they have to now try to get back in, and that may become increasingly more difficult for them. In states that have passed alternative educational sort of programs, these students are encouraged to go there. And not all states provide this because not all states have done this by statute. If they tend to go to these schools, they tend not to have the same academic rigor, they don't keep up with their classes, if they fall behind due to suspension in states where they don't have alternatives, they tend to fall out of school altogether. If they're expelled, the likelihood is fairly high that they're going not to be able to keep up. Once a student falls behind, he or she is likely, more than likely he, to drop out. The other problem has come along, and that is No Child Left Behind, where now we had high-stakes testing. And if there was a sense that the student was not going to be able to keep up, that he was going to sort of impact the metrics on the margins, he, more than likely, was encouraged to drop out and pursue a GED. So some who are making the argument that this is how the school-to-prison pipeline works argue that when these students are suspended or expelled or encouraged to withdraw because they're not going to perform well, they tend to have an environment, a home, a primary environment that lacks structure. Without that structure, they will find themselves falling in with others who may be encouraging them down a path that will lead to delinquency, status offending, or perhaps serious major crimes. So the question becomes, assuming that this is the problem, there are institutional needs that are not sensitive to students' needs, so that when youthful exuberance is treated as a crime, if they act out, however little, however large, and the police are called, and police are now looking for criminal conduct, and if they're arrested at the schools, and although it's dropping, I saw some numbers that show it's actually dropping by serious percentages, but nevertheless it's happening, and part of the concern is that if they're arrested at school, they may be referred to a juvenile justice court, and that begins their road, some would argue, towards serious criminal behavior downstream. The argument also goes that to the extent that they are now dropping out, falling behind, pursuing GEDs in structured, unstructured ways, there is a chance, this is the sort of the length and breadth of the sort of the argument, that they will end up engaging in crimes. And so usually the response from those people who are looking at this, and let me tell you the response are coming from parents, teachers, principals, and advocates who are saying that there should be other ways to handle this problem, not just with this kind of punitive, disciplinary sort of policy. So they talk about, well, what are some of the problems? And generally the problems tend to be, well, the institutions are ill-equipped. If you have low SES students attending schools and high SES districts, you're going to have these kinds of problems. So how are the counselors prepared to meet the demands of these particular kinds of students? And so there's a faulting of the per capita spending, there's a faulting of principals, there's a faulting of teachers, and there's a faulting of guidance counselors. But where you don't find fault, and let me tell you, this is a problem in every jurisdiction, where you don't find fault is where I believe it begins. And where I think it begins is, in fact, the family. How am I doing on time? 4 minutes left? This is sad. Anyway, so let me just cut right to it. So in my effort to try and get to the heart of the problem, which I believe is the primary environment, I'm looking at, I'm not a psychologist, so forgive me if I am not completely conversant in the language, but I'm interested in psychology. But there's a test out there called the thematic apperception test, and what it does, it measures projection. And what it's looking for is the degree to which unconscious desires or goals are governing our behavior. And what psychologists know is that if you ask for it, you won't get it because we have very powerful defense mechanisms. And so what they do is they give you a series of cards. Henry Murray and Morgan developed this, his assistant, back in the 30s. And what they did was they figured out, after doing a number of sort of validity tests, that you needed about 20 cards that would show ambiguous situations in tones of grays, blacks, and whites. And they would ask the person to use their creative literary imaginations to try and figure out what the cards meant. So how did they get there? What's going on? What does it mean? And how does it end? And Basil von der Kloek, who wrote this book called The Body Keeps Score, talks about TET. That's when I first got interested in it, and I saw how it was working. They took a case and control. The case is what they're looking at. The controls are ways of checking validity. And they showed these students pictures, one picture, two pictures. Well, he illustrated in his book, but one picture had a father under a car that was jacked up, and two kids were standing by. Each of them had tools, and they showed it to the case and controls, and they said, well, what do you think is going on? Uniformly, across the groups, they said, well, if the jack fails, Dad is going to get hurt. Fairly straightforward kind of projection. But the case group, when they began to answer the questions, what's likely to happen, how did it happen, what do you think the outcome is going to be, they all told horror stories. And the case group were children who were directly harmed at home by their caregivers. The control group had witnessed violence outside the home but hadn't experienced it within the home. Well, apart from saying if the jack fails, Dad will get hurt, they all had happy endings. After Dad finishes working on the car, they're going to go out and get ice cream, and they're going to have cake, they're going to have a good time. You didn't get the same response in terms of outcomes from the case group. It was always deleterious, difficult. Horrible events were going to take place, not just to the father, but also to the children. And so he began to understand that what TAT does, it measures how the child's personalities were shaped. And part of what they're looking at is trying to figure out, if this is your personality, does it mean that if you believe you are in an environment that appears neutral to the rest of us, by the way, but to them looks aggressive, how will you act? Now, there are problems with the TAT test. It lacks validity in some instances because they say, you're not measuring what you're trying to measure, or actually you can't. Or if it's given on a Monday, you get one result. You're given on a Wednesday, you get another result, same group. Or if there's not sufficient context, the researchers, the psychologists will impose their own unconscious motives, desires, and biases onto the test. So you get a problem. But fortunately, I'm skipping way ahead. But fortunately, how many minutes do I have left? Oh, thank you for that. But fortunately, this is what they discovered. That they were successfully able to validate the distinctions between several personality disorders. Antisocial personality, otherwise known as a sociopath, those who disregard other people's rights. Avoidant personalities, chronic feelings of inadequacy. And, just note that people who have these things engage in compensatory behavior to make it up. Some of them happen to be your colleagues. That was a shot, but it's because I work in an institution where some of my colleagues are all compensatory. And if I'm going to say that, it's also true about me. Anyway, borderline personalities, people who have intense anger and have very unstable relationships, and narcissists, people who are engaged in an exaggerated sense of self-importance. I'm sure we have plenty of those around. But the point that they're trying to get at is how do children come to develop these personality disorders? And I begin with the idea, I know I'm running out of time, but please let me say this. I begin with the idea where the neuroscientists begin. They begin by saying if the child's basic needs and impulses from the time he or she enters the world are not met by parents or primary caregivers who have a complete commitment to these children, they begin to sense that they're not wanted, loved, and appreciated. So if you think they're the apple of your eye, they believe that. If you think they're the greatest interruption to your life because you are on the way to do something really wonderful, they will also believe that about themselves. And that becomes part of the inner mapping of the brain. And once the inner mapping is set, it is really difficult to change it. It doesn't mean you can't. So how does this relate to the school-to-prison pipeline? To the extent that these young folks in school are acting out, and this is preschool behavior, this is elementary school behavior, these children have been shaped, their personalities have been molded, the inner mapping of their brain has been set by what caregivers are not doing for them. And in the black community, particularly, and clearly not everyone within the black community, authoritarian parenting or permissive parenting are those things that have the most impact. Authoritarian is sort of emotionally violent, it's psychologically violent, it's physically violent, and it's overly directing. It kills children's imaginations, period. Too permissive, not enough structure. Children are left to do whatever they want to do, whether it's eating, sleeping, going to school, not going to school, doing chores around the house, whatever it is, but mainly not having a relationship. In short, if you don't have a secure attachment to your parents or your primary caregivers, you will have problems in the world. It will impact your personality. It will show up in schools. Those children are targeted by a zero-tolerance policy. They're made to suffer the consequences. But all of the work that I've looked at, not one of them has cited the parent and made the parent directly responsible. Thank you.
Oh, it's already up. I just missed that.
I went over a couple of minutes.
Good morning. I am Professor Janet Steverson from Lewis and Clark Law School, and I am technologically illiterate. So, but I love my PowerPoints. So it's kind of a conflict there. Oh, look at that! It came right up. Slideshow from beginning. All right. This, do you know if this works? Okay, so thank you for having me. I've never been to Kentucky, and yeah, I know. So it's, and I wasn't born in Oregon. I'm from upstate New York, but Lewis and Clark pulled me into Oregon. But it's been wonderful. Everybody's been so nice. It's just been so easy in spite of the fact that I flew out yesterday and I'm flying out today. But it's actually been very nice. So this was a nice segue with the school-to-prison pipeline, giving information about the school-to-prison pipeline. And I just wanted to, Anthony said, called me in the summer, as he is wont to do, and says, Janet, I'm doing this. I need you. And I'm like, no, Anthony, I'm working on the Federal Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act. He's like, no. I need you to talk about, black childhood. And I'm like, no, Anthony, I'm working on the Federal Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act. All right, needless to say, I'm here. I decided that, okay, let me learn about, the school-to-prison pipeline, what's happening in Oregon. I'm the vice president of the Youth Rights Justice nonprofit law firm in Oregon that represents kids. So I was on the phone with our executive director. I need information. And he says, okay. So this is what I've learned in Oregon. It's just a small capsule of a larger problem that is happening. My focus is always not just what is the problem, but what can we do about the problem. So that's what this is just what has Oregon done and what still needs to be done. So the school-to-prison pipeline is just this complex, multidimensional. It basically is things happening in the school that lead the kids to not be in the school, and next thing you know, they're incarcerated. So what I did was I came up with just some statistics. I'm a data person, and I'm really frustrated because I didn't have enough time to get all the data, which is probably good for you guys because you don't actually have to listen to all the data that I would like to have. All right, so I just have some of the basic stuff. I'm just going to run through a few of the slides just to give you a sense of what's going on. So the largest contributor is the suspension and expulsion of students without the provision of, well, we could say adequate alternative schooling for those kids. So if you get expelled for a year, what's happening? Right? And if you're on the streets and without any supervision, needless to say, not good things are happening. All right. So with regard to students of color, of course, it's a zero tolerance laws and policies, starting, of course, with the federal law relating to firearms. So what was it? 1994, right. So under Clinton, we had the Gun-Free Schools Act found unconstitutional. Then 2002, it's reenacted as part of the No Child Left Behind, just tied to federal funding, Commerce Clause, so it's no longer unconstitutional. But it's a pretty narrow one, and it's aimed at gun violence. And so basically what it says is if a child possesses a firearm or brings a firearm to school, then the school has to have a policy that says that child is expelled for at least a year. And the other part of the requirement is that the child has to, they have to refer it to the local criminal justice system, so required referral. What a lot of states didn't realize or didn't pay attention to is that there's actually an exception. It's modified in that the school board, the chief school administrator, can in fact, on a case-by-case basis, modify that expulsion for the firearm. The other thing that the states didn't do, so then we get into the states, even though it says firearm, the state, in terms of the mandatory expulsion, the states actually change it to weapon. Why? Because the required referral is for a firearm or a weapon. All right, and so you're like, okay, first the mandatory expulsion and now firearm or dangerous weapon. So states just generally are saying for any weapon, and then of course you hear the crazy stories about, the kid with the pencil pointing it like a gun, and the school say, we don't have any choice, we got to expel you, all right? So then the states say, all right, we want to have zero tolerance, not just with regard to firearms, but we want to have zero tolerance with regard to lots of stuff. Defacing school property and menacing and acting willful disobedience and pretty much not acting right. All right? So you have these zero tolerance laws coming into all of the states. Kids are being expelled, suspended at really high rates. In addition to the zero tolerance, though, you also have disparate treatment of students of color, which goes back to what Michelle was talking about in terms of the perception of how children act, and the perception of administrators as well as teachers in terms of a black child and how they act, and whether that is menacing with regard, as opposed to a white child, and whether that is menacing, and not surprisingly, more menacing with regard to black children, which leads to, and then of course there's a lack of access to alternative schooling. So then that leads to particular statistics. I'm just pulling up Oregon. You got 88,000 suspensions. Oregon is not that big of a state. But what was interesting for me is that nearly half of the suspensions were for minor, non-violent, non-drug related incidents. It's not the kids bringing the guns into school. It's not the kids, attacking the teacher. It's for things where you should be handling it in the school principal's office. All right, so it's down from the 107,000 suspensions, woohoo, but it's up from the 66,000 suspensions in 2005. What is happening with those suspensions? You have youth admitted to the Oregon Youth Authority. They have been expelled 4 or more times. Only 15% have never been suspended or expelled from school. Okay, what about students of color? African Americans, 3.3 times more likely. All right, so that is the ones where the teachers are looking at it and saying, all right, you're acting in a way, and they're going to treat that child differently from a white child that acts in exactly the same way. In the studies, I'm a skeptic, and I said, I've seen some of these kids, right? Maybe they're just acting out more than the white kids, and maybe they're just more dangerous kids. Well, the studies control for that. And there is no evidence that these black children are any more dangerous than the white children, all right? But they are being treated differently because of perceptions by the teachers as well as the administrators. Native Americans actually are being treated just as poorly. I use the term Hispanic because that's what the term was in the study, and I know that there's all kinds of different ways of dealing with or talking about Latinos. Okay, so graduation rates. So you say, okay, how are we doing in terms of school? Oregon is pathetic. When that figure came out, all of us were like, what? You've got to be kidding. 69%, second worst in the nation. All right? With regard to blacks, 54% graduation rate. Needless to say, something has to change with regard to Oregon. That's a whole nother story. Suspended expelled students, however, have a very high dropout rate, which is contributing to these poor graduation rates. And then students who drop out are 8 times more likely to be incarcerated than students who remain in school. Okay, Oregon's incarceration rate, that really tall line, that would be the blacks. All right. Blacks make up what? Kids, 3% of the Oregon population. All right, but we're throwing them in prison. So although they only make up 3%, they make up 11% of the youth incarcerated population. Okay, so Oregon, what was done? All right, because I'm looking for the solution. What are we going to do? All right, so we've changed the zero tolerance law. It was spearheaded by Youth Rights and Justice. As I said, Youth Rights and Justice is an independent, not-for-profit law firm established in 1975, represents kids, independency, delinquency, but also with regard to school issues, and they're following. We have a lobbyist, actually, and they're lobbying for legislation on behalf of kids. So they rolled back that zero tolerance law. Now, they can only roll it back so much, because if you want to keep on getting that federal funding, you've got to keep in place that federal law that says mandatory 1-year expulsion if the child possesses a firearm or brings a firearm in. But they did change it so that all that other conduct that was leading to expulsion and suspension was changed. So in particular, this is the bill, doesn't mandate suspension or expulsion. Expulsion is limited to 3 scenarios. So with regard to the 3 scenarios, I had it here somewhere, but I'm running out of time. So you guys can look at my paper. All right, but fairly limited. Prior to expulsion, they actually have to consider the age. Youth Rights and Justice right now is trying to get a law passed that says you may not expel kids up until high school. There's no reason to be expelling and suspending these kids that are in elementary school and middle school. That's what we're working on right now. Limits the length of that suspension. Alternative schooling programs so kids have particular access. And now this is the part, requires schools to implement policies that try to not have bias. All right, like, okay, how are you going to do that? So this is a shortfall. Discretion. Discretion is the problem. Discretion is what leads to the black kids being expelled because of the perception of the kids. So this is what I would like to see. You've got to educate with them with regard to the effects of suspension and expulsion. If teachers care, I come from a family of teachers, they care about the kids. If they know when you are referring that kid to the administrator and that kid has to be expelled, this is what's happening. So you have to educate them. I say you mandate cultural competency training. You got to teach them that a young black lady saying this does not mean that she's actually going to kill you. All right. Continue the trend towards positive behavioral interventions and supports, restorative justice approaches. Oregon now has 61% of the schools that are using that. It really works, and it cuts across socioeconomic. And this is what I now am going to start working on because I'm the president of the Youth Rights and Justice Board beginning in January. That is, we need lawyers. We need lawyers representing the kids. There's due process rights. We need the lawyers. And that's not just Oregon. That's everywhere, all right, so that we can get to this point. Am I done? All right. All right. I have no idea how to end this. Okay, I'll leave that up there.
Right. All right, so I have the anchor leg. Not quite? Oh, well, thank good. I can prove this. All right. Okay, so my talk is entitled, If Hip-Hop is Dead, Did the Law Kill It? How Overzealous Interpretations of Copyright Law Promote Sex and Violence in Hip-Hop Music. We probably could speak about it in all terms of music, but although I'm a tax professor, my cultural genre is hip-hop. All right. So I am a tax professor. Look out for Black Tax Essays on Racism of Tax and Racial Economic Justice, Roman Littlefield. It'll come out in sometime next year. All right. So this is about danger in black children, so I thought it was, and especially a panel on education. So as we have talked about formal education in the school-to-prison pipeline, we also educate our kids through culture and through music, through art and whatnot. And so what are they learning, or I guess for my perception, what are they not learning or mislearning through the degradation of what I used to love, which is hip-hop music. So why do I say that? As a matter of fact, there's an MC, very popular, Nasir Jones, Nas, who wrote an album maybe about 5 years ago, is Hip-Hop is Dead. So what did he mean? I mean, this is a platinum recording artist. Does he mean that, is he just an old fogey like myself? Oh, no, your music today is not as good as my music back in the day. All right, you know, we were better than you guys. Or does he mean that the four elements of hip-hop is considered to be emceeing, breakdancing, graffiti, and DJing. And it has been reduced more or less to just rapping. Right? And not even emceeing, just rapping as a part of emceeing. So does he mean that the four elements have been disrespected? Perhaps. But at the same time, that's kind of a New York City-ish South Bronx view of hip-hop. And I don't think anyone proposed that you have to have a Hajj to the Bronx in order to call yourself hip-hop. What I think he means is that the music has remained stagnant. What I think he means is that there is the death of what I would call hip-hop instrumentalism. That before there was what I'm going to call the hip-hop copyright cases that, in my view, were overzealous and required producers to pay money for sampling when it wasn't appropriate. It raises the price of creating the music and forces us to rely on lyrics. It forces us, or at least encourages companies to lower their risk. If they have higher costs, they tend to lower their risk. And the least riskiest form of entertainment in any genre has always been sex and violence. And just as an anecdote for those that may remember and go way back in the day with me, if you go back to Grandmaster Flash and the Wheels of Steel, if you go back to Jazzy Jeff and Touch of Jazz, up until 1989, 1990, you had hip-hop music that was entirely instrumental. No lyrics at all, collages of samples. Right? And even some of the music itself, from Def Jam, Shockley Brothers, Public Enemy, or whatnot, so many samples, it would be so costly today that you just don't have it. And now you just have a couple chords and someone rhyming over them. So how did we get to this point? There was first the Bismarcky case that held that, yes, you must pay for your sampling. I'm not going to go too much into the detail of each particular case for the sake of time. But then there was a second case called that we'll call the Beastie Boys case. The Beastie Boys case brought some hope because they sampled less than about 3 notes of someone's music, and one of the circuit courts of appeals said, well, that's de minimis. Right? That's de minimis. I mean, you can barely even tell whose it was. And said, okay, that's a score. Because I think there should be a balance. I shouldn't be able to take your whole work and pass it off as my own and just throw some lyrics on top. At the same time, if it's imperceptible to the common listener as to where it came from, I don't think you should have to pay. So there was this balance, and then we had a third case called the NWA case, and we went backwards in time, where they said when it comes to sampling a sound recording, in copyright you have the sound recording and you have the underlying composition. The Beastie Boys case dealt with the underlying composition. The NWA case dealt with the actual sound recording and said there is no de minimis exception to sampling off of a sound recording, the actual disc or the actual tape, or I guess the computer code at this point. Which is very interesting because the court said, oh, we can't believe that there's any reason why this would stifle the useful arts, right? Copyright is to promote the useful arts, as it says in the Constitution. It's not to enrich authors. It is to promote the useful arts, and the payment of authors is towards that. So, but they said it doesn't stifle any arts to make these artists pay. Well, yes, it does in this very simple way. If there's no de minimis exception for sound recording, cutting and scratching a record is illegal. Right? Just the chewit, right? Everybody knows that. Right? That is a de minimis copying of a sound recording. And it is thus illegal under this ruling. Now, what saves folks is that it's so imperceptible you would never know whose record has been sampled. But through the law, it is clear that is itself hip-hop turntablism, the musical instrument that hip-hop created and spread around the world, is by itself illegal. 5 minutes, fantastic. Why shouldn't it be? Again, so there always has been a fair use exception in copyright law. So why hasn't the fair use provision been applied to sampling in hip-hop music, especially for things that are that low, and especially to the extent, and I think this is important, there's a bunch of fair use factors, and again, I'm not going to go through each individual one, but what I think is most important is that forcing hip-hop music to pay for samples that are imperceptible, that are not passing off. That means we're basically compensating the original author far beyond their original expectations. And if copyright law entirely is to promote the useful arts, right, then there is no need to compensate the original author beyond their original expectations. It is their original expectations which causes them to create art. It is the fulfillment of that expectations that inspires the rest of us to create the art. To the extent you are going and compensating beyond them, beyond that, you're not promoting the useful art. You are just siding with one group over another because you favor them for some reason, right? And again, as a critical theorist, it is interesting that the Bismarcky case was kind of pro-hip-hop. The Beastie Boys case was anti, and then the NWA case becomes kind of backwards in time. So again, the implications of this, if we're going to raise the cost, if we're going to force producers to pay for samples, hip-hop wouldn't even exist in the first place if we did this back in 1973 to 1980, right, to require folks to have to pay to create the records. So this puts more power again in the hands of the large-scale producers who basically are selling hip-hop to a majority audience who already has a particular perception of what black youth means, what it means to be hood, what it means to come from the ghetto, and to keep recycling and recycling and recycling it. And I would compare this. Where is there a regime that's very similar where copyright law is not overzealously protected? That would be dancehall reggae. Dancehall reggae and hip hop are cousins. As a matter of fact, DJ Kool Herc, the originator of hip hop, is a Jamaican and brought the sound system technology to New York and whatnot. Dancehall is very similar. And you will see that we're not going to say that there is no sex or violence in dancehall reggae, and we're not going to say that there was no sex and violence in hip hop prior to 1989. What we are going to say is that the breadth of the genre was much, much broader. Storytelling, comedians, and what have you. And just about now, I wrote this paper about 3 or 4 years ago, so it's been a little bit of time. But just about 5 or 6 years ago, Queen Ifrica had a hit song on a lot of Jamaican radio, South Florida, etc. The song title was "Daddy Don't Touch Me There." Right? I'm going to tell on you one day, I swear. Mm-hmm. Right? It's almost inconceivable at this time that such an important topic would be dealt with in hip-hop at this time by a major production company, right? Because of the cost of the music, the cost of getting it on the radio, the cost of distributing it requires us to stay away from things that are that controversial, and requires us to say, you know what, in order to make money, especially in this environment, we need to always lower the risk, the lowest risk, sex and violence. Okay. What's that? Fantastic. So let's tie this even more directly into what we're talking about today. This idea of Ferguson, this idea of black children and what have you, because hip hop and culture, art, music is education. It is education. And to the extent we're doing this, I'm going to go from art to economics. Right? As critical theorists, it is my view in a very much larger context that we have to embrace economics. We have to at least, if not embrace it, deal with neoclassical economics, etc. And if neoclassical economics, if a free market is a progenitor of meritocracy, then we are again allowing an educational system, or a part of the educational system, i.e. culture, to degrade the market, right? We don't have a free market. Never had a free market. A free market requires everyone to be a profit maximizer. We know that's not true, right? You would not sell your children for any price, right? For the right price, right? Everyone is, we have perfect competition. We know that's not true. You need capital, all types of capital to compete. So we know that's an imperfect market structure. We know that when it comes to perfect information, that's obviously not true. No one has perfect information about anything. And then as far as transaction costs, a perfectly free market would have none. I would at least ask for them to be distributed equally, and we know that's not even true. And then if it comes to race, we know that these distinctions are asymmetrical, right? We have asymmetrical profit maximization, asymmetrical perfect competition, asymmetrically imperfect information, and we have asymmetrically distributed transaction costs. And I'm suggesting that hip-hop is, in this current form, or the rap music industry, if you want to distinguish from hip-hop, is exacerbating these asymmetries, right? Again, if to the extent you're a profit maximizer, if you're being told you're nothing, if you don't want to be nothing, then doing nothing will get you there, right? And if that's what hip-hop is telling our youth, then how are they to then transform it and say we're going into profit maximizing mode? How is it when they're told that these are the only areas for you to compete with, sports and entertainment and the drug war or whatnot? Then again, we exacerbate the asymmetries in competition. When it comes to information about yourself, who are you? What are you capable of? What are you supposed to know about others in the world? Again, to the extent we cabin that into this little small world, we are not just hurting culture, we're not hurting people, we are hurting the idea or even the existence of a free market. We're hurting the existence of the idea of meritocracy. And to the extent we talk about transaction costs and we normalize the idea that drugs, violence, or whatever can be, thank you, Mr. Farley, zoned into black neighborhoods, then we again, even under a neoclassical economic sense, have explained and described how race and racism exist today. I think I'm done.
So we have this good fortune to have our fifth panelist who's able to make it. This is Frances Waters. She did some research on unexpected consequences of desegregation. She's presently a United Methodist pastor and a Huffington Post and .com writer. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Glad to have made it here. And I also was a lawyer, so that other little piece there too. But what I'm going to talk about in my short time is I wanted to bring a different perspective to the discussion. So this will be sort of more of a personalized, sort of more first-person narrative that leads us to an interdisciplinary argument for looking at how we address these issues around what's happening with our black children. So in addition to, so having gone to law school, I'm a pastor, I'm a writer, and what I've been gathering are stories about what's happening to our children, in particular black boys, with in-school profiling. And so when you look at the idea of sort of cradle-to-prison pipeline, or the school-to-prison pipeline, oftentimes we're looking at communities where people are, where the children are maybe in low-income situations or where they're in neighborhoods where they're being profiled in general in their communities. But what I'm finding and what I have found and what I'm looking at and writing about is the idea that actually it's a much more pernicious problem where black boys in particular, and I believe that it's happening with black girls too, but I'm looking right now in particular at what's happening with black boys, whether they're on street corners or in prep schools, are still subject to the same kinds of ideas and stereotypes and misconceptions as each other, regardless of where they are. So there are three things I wanted to talk about in particular. So first person, I have been, as a mother of three black boys, pulled into the system in a very interesting way. My 5-year-old in kindergarten, who is an tag student, talented and gifted, top student in the class. We were late for school 5 times. His father and I, being Harvard Law School graduates notwithstanding, we were called into truancy court for that. Got a notice for truancy court. So it was one thing to talk about the theory. And so, of course, I have these wonderful conversations with all of my wonderful lawyer friends. I got a notice to go to truancy court because my son had been late for school. Now, I had other colleagues and other friends whose children had been late for school a number of times who were not called into truancy court. When I got to the court, it was very interesting. It was a multi-city court, and so they had jurisdiction over a certain part of the county. Every face, and I do not exaggerate, every face in the courtroom except one were black and brown, Hispanic and black parents, most of whom were poor. But every face. And so I began to wonder, how did the district decided who got called into truancy court and who didn't? Now, this is all anecdotal, so I have not gone through their records to see, but I made 3 trips to the court, and each time I went to the court, all the faces were black and Hispanic. And then when you looked at it, many of them could not afford the fines, so some of the older children were being put in jail until they could pay the fines. And so they were missing more school. So if the idea or the objective of truancy court is to get the kids back into school so they can learn in meaningful ways, the idea of jailing poor people who can't afford to pay the fees for truancy court so they can miss another 2 weeks of school until they can pay the fine begs the question, are we looking at ways to increase participation in education, or are we looking at a pejorative system that really is looking at relegating these students to further future, not success, but failure? One of the cases that was most striking in the Houston area that caught my eye was a young Mexican-American young lady who actually got put into a holding cell with violent offenders, and her only crime had been missing school, and her parents could not pay the fine, and so she was there for 3 weeks. Having spent 3 weeks in prison because her parents couldn't pay the fine, she then was left back in school a year because she had missed 3 weeks of school because she was in jail. And then, of course, the question becomes then, does she go back to school in light of that? So just a little first-person narrative. And so I had the choice of either being charged with a misdemeanor or paying a $500 fine and taking a course on parenting. Ironically, my child had missed and become late to school on 2 of the days because we were applying to sort of the top private schools in Dallas where he was accepted. It was very special. So that's sort of a little reality check. So what we don't talk about is the fact that there's something going on that's quite pernicious, and it's based on race. Because when you look at the files, there's no way, in the county I'm talking about where every face in the courtroom was black or brown, was 60% Anglo, white. So just the odds, and I'm not looking at statistics is not my main area, that every child that needs to be pulled into truancy court was black or brown is very highly unlikely. That's case number 1. Case number 2. Another friend, another lawyer in New York, she's a lawyer, husband's a private equity guy, African-American couple, child is at Horace Mann, one of the top schools in New York. 2 months ago, pulled into the head of school's office. And they wanted to meet with them and the counselor because of their 4th grade son, and they had concerns. These were the concerns. We're quite concerned because in an essay that your son wrote about Nelson Mandela, he used the word murder, and we're concerned that he may have violent tendencies. 2 months ago, 2014. I bring up these real life examples because oftentimes we get caught up in case law and we think that it's something that's far away or distant, and I think it's really important to bring it home. So they're very concerned that they want him to see counseling. This is put into his school record. when we talk about profiling, as I said, I'm talking about these cases because I think we get a lot of attention to some of the other cases. Profiling. So they're concerned that he might have violent tendencies because he used the word murder in a Nelson Mandela essay where he said it may have been good that he was not murdered because, etc. Okay. Okay. And so we have these kinds of cases. Finally, when we look at these cases, the last piece I would talk about, the last example I wanted to share too with my own, my son who is 9, a voracious reader, has not been participating in sports. He's one of 3 black boys in the school. He uses recess to read and the common to read. We think he may be exhibiting antisocial behavior because he's not engaging in football with the other little boys at recess. Right. Okay. You can do the math there. So why do I share these things with you? What's happening is that even whether the children are, these boys are excelling in school or whether they're not excelling at school, cases are being made, they're being profiled, and their records are being built so that by the time you get to 16 or 17, if anything happens to you, then your school records show, we said when they were 8 or 9 or 10 that they were exhibiting antisocial behavior. We told you they needed counseling. And so what's happening is that you're having a case that's being built from the time they are, from the ground up, whether they're A students or F students. We're profiling these boys. Okay, so which brings me to my idea about the freedom from fear. There's not only a fear of failing in our society, of being arrested, but there's also a fear of success. So even if you're succeeding, you have to have fear because if you're succeeding, then they might profile you for succeeding in ways that are not fitting into the mold of what's expected as a black boy. So what do we say about this in light of our current situation? When we look at these issues from a legal perspective, I would argue that we have to have an interdisciplinary approach to how we address this because just knowing the case law does not move us by itself from the theory to an actual movement that changes the reality that we're facing. If we don't attack the perceptions and ideas of what's happening and the perceptions of our children, then no matter where they are, whether they excel academically or whether they are failing, they are still subject to the kind of, casting them as criminals or latent criminals in ways that you don't find otherwise. When we talked about this idea of this fourth freedom of freedom from fear, I thought about sort of what was happening when you looked at the whole Brown case. And when you looked at it, it was very interesting because they had to use non-legal methods. You all know the story. So you had to bring in psychology. You had to bring in like the test methodology. You brought in lots of different ways of looking at the issue because at the end of the day, just looking at the precedents and looking at the jurisprudence would not get you to the right answer, right? So Earl Warren's big thing was, at the end of the day, is it right? And so I would argue that even in the midst of conferences like this, we've got to think about how the media is affecting perceptions of our children. We have to look at the ways that even you talk about the music and the hip-hop and the representations of African-American children. Oh, I was born in South Bronx, so shout out to South Bronx here. Okay, so we have to look at the ways in which multiple factors are converging to create perceptions that influence the way in which our children are being treated at every level, whether they're on a street corner or whether they're even in a top prep school. It doesn't matter, and I won't even do the Malcolm X quote. It doesn't matter where they are. They're being perceived in these ways. And so there's no way that we can sit in these wonderful halls and talk about the jurisprudence without really realizing that we've got to have interaction in meaningful ways with other disciplines to help us to construct a meaningful solution or a strategy to really change perceptions of who our children are. The final example I would give in terms of media, the importance of media, it's been proven no matter how evolved we are, human beings learn through storytelling. It's the stories that we're told. That's why every culture, whether it's Eastern, Western, Africa, Asia, there are griots, there are storytellers, because that's how we learn lessons. Well, in our modern day society, the stories are being told by a mass media conglomerate. So for the first time in the last 100 years, you have children in a society that's being told stories that come from all over the place. And so when you look at trends, in the late 80s, HBCUs, historically black colleges, had record numbers of applicants at the time when A Different World was on TV. Law school applications soared when LA Law was the top television show on TV. Medical applications, etc. We are very, very, very susceptible to what we see in media. So since we know that that is the case and that's been shown statistically, then we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean when all the stories being told about our children are told through directors who may or may not even know who they are, and are told through and create stories and false perceptions of who they are, and then have real implications. They have real implications. When teachers see them, they see black boys that remind them of the video. Therefore, he's reading now, but there's pathology at work. We have police officers who see you in your wonderful suit or see Skip Gates on his porch going into his own house, but it's a black man. He must be up to something. And so I would argue, and my point when we're looking at this is that it cannot be enough to say we understand the law and we're going to just fight in the courtroom. We've got to find ways to partner together so that we can create true paradigm-shifting ways of addressing these issues and that take us from just theory to practice where we can create movements that protect our children and move them from a place where they have to worry about fearing for their status in their lives, whether they're performing well or poorly.
I think that's always going to be an issue, right? Whether you and I am more so on the nationalistic side, right? So I tend not to try to convince others of what they ought to do, and think that it's, although I think that's appropriate for others to do, but I think there needs to be a cadre of us that emphasize on what we need to do. That, and again, not to make this too deep, but there's a theory of things called autopoiesis, right? That anything is a system of discourse, right? If that is true, then the more you inject discourse into the thing, the more you control what is said about it. So that means for us as critical race theorists, that is our job within the law, to inject competitive discourse to challenge what is already out there. And so thought of more broadly, when it comes to education, when it comes to race or whatnot, that we have to take the responsibility in hip-hop music or whatnot to inject more positive discourse to compete with those that are negative. Because I am not certain that, as you mentioned, that there is an incentive on the other side to do away with that which attacks them.
I would also argue, so I think that's very true. I think that when the rubber hits the road as parents, so we have a real challenge, especially as African-American parents, because we're challenged to find the right place for our children to be, and we want them academically and socially and otherwise to be fed and to be nurtured. So I think that what you're saying is true. You do inject that kind of discourse in the conversation. I think you first start by having to find a place, especially when you're a parent, as opposed to when you're doing this sort of work theoretically, is find a place that even opens the discourse. So in terms of choosing where you're going to put the child, you aren't going to find a perfect place, but you're going to find a place that's open to it. And what I constantly do, I think that you sort of have to sort of give them different ideas and ways of thinking about it. So I often, when talking with folks, I will inject things they can relate to, like gender. So to help me, maybe if you don't understand race, maybe you understand gender. And so if you don't understand gender, maybe you understand, an immigrant status, or maybe you understand language. It's hard work, and if I were not a parent, I would not be having some of these same conversations. But because I have 3 black boys that I've got to get from pre-kindergarten all the way to college, then for me, I can have the theoretical discussions, but my husband and I also have to figure out how to get these boys in this day and time until we get to the perfect solution through. And one of the ways that we engage in conversations, once we have found the right location. I'm in Dallas. They're not going to Dallas Baptist, whatever place, because that's just not a place that's even open to discussion. I think you first find a place where you can have the discourse. And then when you're having the discourse, it's incumbent upon us to figure out how we have it in meaningful ways. And sometimes that it helps to have sort of cross-platforms. Because I find that oftentimes, for example, there are white women who understand gender. There are a lot of black men who don't get gender. There are a lot of people who black men understand race. I mean, we have so many cross conversations all the time. And I think that one of the ways that you have a conversation is you find platforms and ways to sort of find common ground, and then you sort of then go on to what you're talking about from the common ground.
I also think that, and I agree with both comments, but I also think that, and this is hard, but thinking about what we're doing in the school system with our own kids as a form of activism, so that when you do find that opening, that place that's open to discourse, but as you know, even the most progressive schools have this problem. They say the craziest thing or do the craziest thing. So we always have to be the ones advocating. But thinking of ourselves as doing activism is so key because we're speaking for parents who can't do it. And I think that the deterrent factor that is happening. So to your question, how do you change it? It's a long-term thing. It's not going to happen overnight. But for each parent that's doing that activism role, that activist role, that is speaking for their kid, but they're also speaking for all these children whose parents don't have the time or overwork and so on. At the very least, those educators in that school system are getting the message there are consequences, that there's time spent for those behaviors, so they'll keep checking themselves. And that's the investment, I think. It's not alone it will do it, but that is a major investment together with everything else.
I would simply say that you get active, find the right school, get active, and encourage all the teachers and the staff to take an implicit association test, and they'll discover exactly who they are.
I have a different approach. I invite them to dinner. I talk to them. No, I mean, honestly, what I've discovered at the law school is one reason that we end up having lots of different viewpoints is people actually aren't talking to each other and they're not sharing their stories. So we're starting to just share stories just in the law school, and I've learned so much about all the different people, and they've learned about me, and then you're finding common ground, so just, sometimes it's hard because some of them are pains, but if you can be friends, try and get down and figure out what their story is so that you can then share your story.
This was great, I think. It brought up a lot of questions, and it took me back, not just because Janet is my high school classmate, and I was thinking about the fact that we went to Harvard Law School together with most of the people of color that we went to high school with. But these strategies, right? There's a study from 1973 that when I first came across it, it encapsulated everything about my high school and grade school and junior high experience. Pygmalion, Black and White by Rubovitz and Nair at the University of Illinois. So they looked at expectation effects. And I just want you to comment on these expectation effects. Because some of you may not have heard of them. Right? You control for student test results, present them to student teachers, and tell them falsely, half the kids are bright, half the kids are average. They usually see the bright kids as bright and the average kids as average, even though they were all the same. But when you put race into it, a reverse hallucination takes place that explains a lot of what everyone has said today. That is, the ranking order, if you're given smart white kid, smart black kid, average white kid, is not what you might think it is in the kind of liberal naive day. It's a really malignant order, right? The first, the smart white kid. Second, the average white kid. Sometimes the average black kid. Fourth and last is the black kid they were told was bright, which brings up school as a kind of trap, right? If you exhibit, then the signs of intellectual acuity, that you look like you're moving ahead, you will be perceived, if you're exhibiting this, in black, right? Being bright while black. Right? Being bright while black means that you will be perceived, to the extent someone sees you as bright, as not bright, and as disruptive, and you will get less attention, people will make less eye contact, you will get fewer positive remarks, and fewer smiles. So there's been a lot of these studies. They fall out of fashion lately because no one wants to be unpleasant. It's the core of our educational experience. Because that, where does that leave us? For a lot of us, it leaves us with homeschooling or finding another school. My wife and I go, our daughter's school is half the time out of the country. We found a great school for her in country, but they're looking at difficult.
Well, I would just respond to that. Having
sorry. And there's psychological costs too.
Oh, yes.
Right. Janet who knows me knows the psychological costs.
Okay.
Yes, the Farley boys all the women for the costs.
thing too is that even schools that say they don't track. So finding a wonderful progressive school that is a wonderful school. This is a very our sixth grader was the only black boy in accelerated math, and then seventh grade they're only 10% of the class gets to do Algebra 1. My son had very quickly, and the other ones didn't do as well, so this is my start here. A average, 99 percentile, not only in the country, but in independent schools, so when you're comparing Andover, Exeter, et cetera. He was not chosen to be in Algebra 1. So we had a meeting. So met with a teacher. Teacher first asked me if I understand the curriculum. Let's start with that intimidation of parents, right? Yes, I do understand the curriculum. In fact, I've laid out their curriculum so they go to college. I've got that down, fine. And then he said there are 3 criteria: grades, test scores, and ability. Well, grades. He's got an A in your class. Test scores, 99 percentile. So it comes down to the subjective ability. Turns out I talked to a black teacher he had. They said they don't track. She told me offline, not only is he an excellent student, she said, guess who the #1 math student is in the class at this prep school? It's my son. But they had not had a black student in the advanced math in 7th grade in the last 10 years. And so even the teacher saw not the top math student, he saw a black boy. He had never placed a black child in Algebra 1 for 7th grade. You've got to be an activist. You've got to be engaged. They asked, well, and she said, the principal said, well, do you want me to talk to them? I said, you can talk to them. We're going to handle this. We handle it. Doing great. He's an geometry in 8th grade, whatever. But the actual issue is this. It's happening, and most of the parents don't know it. And most of the parents in our school are professional black parents who are doctors, lawyers, et cetera, because they assume we're in a great school. I don't have to look anymore. I don't have to think anymore. And so they're just so happy to be there, and they assume if their children do well, they will be put in the right classes. And so one of the things that we have to do is be constantly vigilant and not have the illusion that it's 2014. We've got, let's not even go through the whole Obama thing. We've got all the, people don't assume that that's the case. You've got to be constantly vigilant. The only reason that he's in the right class is because he's got a compulsive mother who made sure that he was in the right class. But you have to be engaged and know what's happening. And so it's happening, and that's one personal story. I've seen it happen a number of the times.
Another element of this regarding perception, I think, is something we don't talk about much, which is the fear. The people really expect some kind of investment from children of color. So when children of color are doing well and are positive and are confident, there's a high price to pay for it. So when we talk in the studies, when we talk about acting out and being loud, there's a consequence. But there's also a consequence for being a confident child. And this is coming to a head with this new generation when we have a number of a growing group of really progressive parents that are hands-on with education and know how the school system works. And they're developing this really early confidence in our kids. And you see it in progressive school. It's just this immediate pushback. And I want you to think about how this is manifested in your own workplace. How many times do we sit around and have this conversation about the overperforming black person on the faculty or the overperforming black person in any work context, and the price that you pay is not the same as any other group because we are running against a stereotype. The stereotype is that we're supposed to be begging for something. That it's a favor that we hear. So we, as adults, we always have to be affirming. We always have to be confident and take it in the chin and the psychological effects. But I'm very interested in the ways in which we can change the narrative. I have so many conversations with other groups saying, I'm not asking a favor, right? Basically you have to come out and say, I'm dope, right? And I'm not going to apologize. But also, I want us to think about the ways in which this is so pervasive and has happened for so long, hundreds and hundreds of years, that there's parts of us that have to do that work as well. That we internalize, it's just the vestiges, legacy. Parts of us have that place where we have to calculate and say to ourselves, no, I'm going to stand in this light and not come from a position of asking, of begging, because I am. Right? I am legitimate. I have all those qualities. And children that we're raising, some of the kids we're raising are able to do this more naturally. And because parents are doing such a good job, and hopefully we can do the same with other children who might not have the same support system. But the problem is that society is not catching up. Society's not ready. How many, you talk about this in common conversation. Someone, even an athlete who's too confident, is a problem. So we have to really push back on this, on personal relationships, and in the context where we operate. It's not acceptable for anyone to be expected to bow down and be when they are doing their work based on qualifications that are sound and other people are not expected to do. It's not that idea of standing in the light is intangible, but there are really, really, really strong consequences to our children.
Well, I would just say, again, I guess I'm repeating myself, but I think as important as we've just talked about in getting society to change, you also have to build up the child. Since you know these things are coming, you know that this is not going to change in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You have to arm your children. My son, my brother and I went the farthest in our family. We took the SATs in the 7th grade. I wanted to encourage my son to take the SATs in the 8th or 9th grade. The school teachers went behind my back and tried to discourage him. And of course, in the beauty, the thing that kept me sane is he thought it was fun. Right? That he thought when they were worried, we don't want them to get discouraged. He thought that was absolutely hilarious, and just pulled out a Sudoku and whatnot and did more puzzles and whatnot, because that's how he feels about tests. That tests aren't this, I'm determining how smart you are. It's a game like Sudoku and a crossword puzzle, and that's what we want him to feel, because he's confident he knows he can beat those things. Right? So I think on one hand, yes, we're trying to change society, we're trying to change perceptions, but the most important change to me has to be within black boys themselves, and that's our responsibility to give it to them.
And I want to make sure we're saying black boys, but also black girls, because that's extremely important.
Okay, I wanted to ask you panel the issue of the role of lawyers in all of it, and because Janet has social justice lawyering and what that means, as law professors and as lawyers, how is our role? How do we play part of this? I think some of this is about the local actions that lawyers can take and get involved in.
And actually, what we were talking about at dinner was people think that, as a lawyer, you have to be a public interest lawyer in order to do this. And that's not the model that I'm actually thinking of with what I was talking about with the volunteer corps for youth rights and justice. There's a model that they already have. It's coming out of a law firm. It's a Cliff project, and it's just one or two lawyers that are at Youth Rights and Justice that are supervising a whole cadre of corporate tax, whatever lawyers, and training them on how to do, this one is sexual registration for juveniles, but you can do the same thing in any area if you've got the experts who are then training the pro bono volunteer attorneys. That's how I think you can get more and more attorneys out there representing the kids and helping out the kids, in particular in law schools, since law schools are changing their models of what it is, and our law students need those practical skills. The clinics can also, you can take the students and put them into the externships or internships with these particular organizations, and they actually are going to be on the ground and helping as well. So that's what we were talking about at dinner, is that you can do it even if you are not a, quote, public interest attorney.
I think the other thing that lawyers can do, like for example, I write and you can be a translator for people. So for example, the piece I did in the post about Trayvon Martin sort of went viral, and then I did an NPR piece on it, which actually opened up dialogue, which caused a panel or two to be done in Dallas, both on the school level and actually the Black Bar Association. So that's the other thing I would say too, is to not keep all of the information and conversations to ourselves, to actually figure out ways to sort of write about it, talk about it, do commentaries on it in ways that engage those in the community too, and help them figure out how they can be constructively engaged in the conversation. So that's another possibility, that lawyers can really use all that great knowledge and research you've done and let the public know about it in ways they can understand.
I would say, again, trying to take a look at this from a different angle, not just black lawyers, but black professionals and whatnot. We have to accept that we operate under the same system and we've been indoctrinated in the same way. And so we have to change our own perceptions of our own people. I've heard so many people talk about, ooh, LaQuisha, what does that mean? As if they know what Elizabeth means. So I think as black lawyers, black professionals, et cetera, we have to take a look at how we've been indoctrinated and how we view our own kids before we also go and tell other people how they should view our kids.
Yes, sir. Last question.
We talked about the effects of suspension and expulsion on students. I was just wondering if there are any movements around the states to abandon the SCOT 10-day standard as being suspended for 10 days is de minimis and not affecting your education. Is there any movement to abandon it? It seems very archaic.
So the 10-day is not a big deal? Is that what you want to have turned back?
Movement to say being suspended from school for an hour, that should require the whole due process.
I haven't seen that movement, but I'd like to see that movement. I mean, other than the movement where they don't want any suspension or expulsion, and because it does, in fact, have a dramatic impact on the kids. So I shouldn't say no, there isn't any movement. Yes, there is, but they're focusing on the big thing of rolling back the zero tolerance, and then once they roll that back, it's like, okay, now let's focus on the fact that you shouldn't actually be suspending most of the kids unless there is severe harm. So right now their priorities are on the big stuff. But yeah, I think they'll get there. Yeah.
I'm in Texas, one of the worst offenders, so we just are. And so, so we basically had that report come out. We know that they're suspending black children at 3 times the rate of white children, and that's sort of a conservative estimate. And so there was some outcry, there was some reporting, but there's not been any movement to sort of change that. And so I think that similarly, I don't know if there's anything that's happening. There's a lot of discussion going on right now in the legislature among those who are concerned. A lot of pushback, even though we have shown conclusively it's happening. But I'm not sure how we figure out how to move now from the report to actually making sure we do some legislative advocacy that makes a difference.
Actually, I'm sorry, but we are out of time. So thank you very much for